It's a pleasure to invite you all back to what is the final event of our conference sessions. We had a great conference yesterday, and I'm very pleased that we are ending it with such a great speaker. Shashi Tharoor is probably known to many of you. If I were to stand here and list his achievements, we would probably have an AIIA National President's Lunch rather than breakfast at some stage. Relevantly for us, I think he has been the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. He was nominated by India to become the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he is also a four-term, I think, MP in the Lok Sabha, or Indian Parliament. He serves on various committees, I think at the moment, relevantly, the Committee for External Affairs. And he has a long list of international awards, including Spain's Order of Carlos III and France's Légion d'honneur. He might have come to many of your attentions through a rather magnificent speech that he gave at the Oxford Union some years ago, which formed the basis for this book. I've lost the dust jacket, which has various titles. An Era of Darkness is the copy that I have. I've also seen Inglorious Empire, and I think What the British Did in India was the title of one of the versions. It's a fantastic read, as are all of his writings, actually. But today he's going to be talking about global shifts in world politics and whether we're moving towards a new bipolarity. And he has told me that he will take questions afterwards, and you can ask him questions about his talk, but he's also offered kindly to answer any other questions you might have, for example, about Indian politics. So, with that, I shall invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor up to the stage to regale us with his extremely impressive erudition.
Thank you very much for that, Bryce. No British bashing today. I'm sitting next to one, I guess. But as the British Conservative Party says to its Prime Ministers, I shall not keep you long. My topic is, are we again facing a bipolar world? And I do want to say it's such a pleasure to have been at the conference yesterday and to join all of you this morning at the Australian Institute of International Affairs National President's Breakfast. And from what I've been given to understand, you've been given a breakfast that was hot and a discussion on a war, or the possibility thereof, which is cold. Now, exactly how cold this war is going to be, I'll get to shortly. But before that, I would like very much to thank the Institute for inviting me to the conference and asking me to deliver this year's President's Breakfast speech. Founded in 1933 by member organizations that trace their roots even earlier, this groundbreaking institute has emerged in the near century since its inception as Australia's oldest and most vigorous private forum for research and scholarship on politics and international affairs. Instead of taking stringent political stances on grave geopolitical issues, which may stifle the voice of its staff and fellows, the Institute places its prestige at the disposal of responsible individual voices, allowing them to articulate their outlooks by listening to the dictates of their consciences. And as a result, I think the publications of the Institute, such as the Australian Journal of International Affairs, the preeminent academic journal of this country on the subject, the quinquennial series Australia and World Affairs, and the popular online publication Australian Outlook, all tend in many ways to rally on the right side of history, championing the causes dear to humanity across our world. Another reason why I'm particularly happy to attend your conference and talk to you all this morning is just how broad-based the membership, a dazzling sample of which is here with us today, is, from venerable foreign policy practitioners and academics to public-spirited citizens with no formal grounding in foreign affairs, generals who've served around the world. The Institute boasts really a remarkable array of members, staff members, fellows, all of whom bring a diversity of views to the table, as I discovered yesterday, and this has enabled you all to take an enriching and kaleidoscopic view of many a geopolitical concern. So let me move on now to the question of whether our world is again on the brink of a Cold War. A question I've lately been grappling with in the Indian context, whether India finds itself in the crosshairs of two rivals in this putative Cold War 2.0. Now, while India's diplomatic and strategic ties with the United States continue to flourish, there's recently been a breakthrough in our relations with China, which had been frozen or indeed under very heavy strain since the 2020 skirmishes between the People's Liberation Army and the Indian soldiers along the Indo-China border in the high Himalayas. These facts present India with precarious terrain that we'll carefully have to navigate. At the same time, of course, the question remains, are we facing a crucial choice in a bipolar world? What about the context in which I'm asking this question? Post-World War II, it had become clear that the US and the USSR were the only nations with the structural power to have overweening influence on the international system. The Cold War thus represented a global system of bipolarity. That's where this notion comes from. Each side assembling their allies into their spheres of influence, and some staying non-aligned. With the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the era of globalization dawned and coincided, for the most part, with what was dubbed the unipolar moment, a brief period of a couple of decades, roughly 1990 to 2010, of complete dominance, political, military, economic, and technological, of the world by the United States of America. In this period, the US was now enjoying its unipolar moment, an era in which Washington faced no near-term rivals for global power and influence, and one in which the defining feature of international politics was American dominance. But soon it became clear that the US was no longer going to be uncontested in any of these domains, political, technological, economic, military. Roughly around the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, pundits recognized that they'd emerged on the global scene the spectre of Beijing. China's so-called peaceful rise for the previous quarter of a century, fueled by American investment in its industries and burgeoning export trade for its manufacturers, had culminated in supplanting the US as a manufacturing and industrial power, rivaling it in economic size and exceeding its surpluses, as well as challenging it in new cutting-edge technologies like 5G. So after decades of uncontested hegemony, another aspiring hegemon had emerged with the resources to make the Americans sweat. No wonder American thinkers started calling for policymakers to evolve a comprehensive strategy to counter China, much as George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow in 1946 led to the birth of the containment strategy that hemmed in the Soviet Union. So my answer, since I've cited that background, to the question, are we again living in a bipolar world, is a qualified yes. Yes, because two major powers are again contesting each other's power and influence around the globe, but qualified because this is not the bipolarity we knew during the Cold War. For one thing, the US and China have multiple connections with each other that were absent between the US and the USSR. The US is the largest investor in the Chinese economy. The Chinese own more US Treasury bonds than any other government. The US sends more tourists to China than any Asian country, and there are more Chinese students in the US than those of any other nationality. The Indians are catching up. And these are two powers at odds, but with multiple channels of contact, dialogue, and economic cooperation available to them that just did not exist during the bipolarity we knew earlier, the tensions of the Cold War. And so before assessing the quality of this Sino-American bipolarity, we should look briefly at two broader trends in the world that contextualize the dynamic we see between Washington and Beijing, and necessitate perhaps a more nuanced analysis of the state of our geopolitics. Europe, since the Russia-Ukrainian war, has undergone an interesting reorientation. Even before the invasion, member states were taking steps to meet a 2006 target of spending a minimum of 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, impelled no doubt because of President Trump's implicit threat to pull back from the US commitment to NATO if they didn't. The war in Ukraine not only accelerated this trend, it also drove the likes of Sweden and Finland, historically neutral states, into the arms of NATO. While NATO as a result is now stronger than ever, the re-election of President Trump has substantially transformed the dynamic. If he pushes for a peace settlement, as he says he will in Ukraine, will all of Europe go along? And will Europe embroil itself in taking sides when it comes to the US and China? It isn't like Europe has no interest vested in China. A 2023 European Council on Foreign Relations poll found that most Europeans want to remain neutral in any US-China conflict and are reluctant to decouple from China, despite recognizing the dangers of its growing economic presence in Europe. Europeans generally do not seem to see China as a power that wants to undermine Europe. Despite Beijing's refusal to condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the prevailing view is that China is still a necessary partner for Europe. Furthermore, Europe's internal dissensions are far from resolved. The crisis of values in Europe is exacerbating the gains made by the right in Germany, Greece, Austria, Italy, France, the Netherlands, amongst others, and these are the consequence of a precarious uptick in the popularity of populism, predicated on a resentment of globalization, topped off by the cultural grammar of hyper-nationalism. When Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History 3 decades ago, and the world waxed eloquent about the triumph of liberal democracy as the time-honored affirmation of social, political, and economic organization, and neoliberal capitalism enjoyed its heyday in the era of globalization, few anticipated the destructive potential of the backlash to the very trends that were seen as triumphant harbingers of global prosperity. Europe is bearing the brunt of this backlash. And I've talked about this in greater detail at the conference yesterday, so I won't repeat myself, but if you want me to describe how I see this backlash, I'll be happy to address it in our Q&A. Now, then there is what is referred to as the rise of the rest, the so-called middle powers that have found considerable diplomatic leeway in the weakening bipolarity between the two major powers. From climate financing to digital infrastructure and global public goods, the developing world has found the space and in many cases the capability to make its voice heard. The voice of the Global South Summit in India last year was not just a glamorous diplomatic show, it signified the growing space for the developing world to express itself unencumbered by the need to placate a global hegemony. These countries realize that in world affairs, you're either at the table or on the menu. And they are jostling for seats at the table. The increasing prowess of the Global South in innovation, sustainability, and entrepreneurship, coupled with the significant demographic advantage the youthful South has over the aging North, gives these countries the leverage to be non-West without being anti-West. Those who were once the others not only matter, but are germane to key global questions. Europe has become a military theatre for Asian actors, for example. Large-scale deliveries of drones, ammunition, and weapons components from Iran, North Korea, and China are helping Russia fight the Ukrainian forces and rain death on civilians in Ukrainian cities. Iranian military advisors have been reported on the ground in occupied Ukraine, although the Iranian government denies their presence there. South Korea, which has emerged as a major weapons producer, is already selling arms to NATO and could increase its support for Ukraine in response to North Korea's increasing involvement on the Russian side. Japan has emerged as a major political and diplomatic supporter of Kyiv and will have a key role in the reconstruction of Ukraine when it begins. Contrast this to the third camp of the Cold War era, the non-aligned movement. A complicated and idealistic bouquet of post-colonial perspectives, non-alignment had been the vehicle for developing countries to assert their independence from the competing claims of the two superpowers. There's an apocryphal story about Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, and the man who conceived the idea of non-alignment, having a conversation or an argument with John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who famously or notoriously denounced neutrality between good and evil is itself evil, he had said. So Dulles allegedly said to Nehru, in a question we've heard more recently from the lips of an American president, "Are you with us or against us?" And Nehru replied, "Yes." So we're with you when we agree with you, we're not with you when we don't agree with you. And that essentially was both a way of safeguarding a sovereignty long fought for and recently won, particularly for an ex-colonial country like India, and a way of avoiding compromising it through the compulsions of bloc politics. Whether the non-aligned movement stood up to its stalled ideals is a different question altogether. As a body representing the global south, it turned out to be too weak and fractured to stave off the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan or the US's Persian Gulf interventions in 1990, and more recently the wars in Iraq, Libya and Syria. Besides, after spending decades calling for peace and disarmament, the non-aligned movement's core members now rank among the world's leading weapons purchasers. So, with this context in place, let's quickly turn to how the novel Sino-American bipolarity is quite unique and unprecedented in the post-World War II global order. First, the most obvious difference is that the US and China are deeply interlinked economies, as I've said. This was not true in the US-Soviet Cold War, where there was simply no economic interpenetration between the two blocs and almost no examples of cooperation, let alone investment or significant trade. Deng Xiaoping's strategy of bide your time, hide your intentions, and do not take leadership was meant to propel China to the heights of economic power before it staked any claim to global hegemony. China's high level of interdependence with the world economy is the reason why some observers prefer to use labels other than Cold War in describing the current US-China bipolar system, suggesting terms such as competitive coexistence, cold coexistence, or conflictual coexistence. That may become somewhat more relevant with President Trump's ascent. But the level of interdependence in the US-China rivalry leaves more room for economic warfare than was the case during the earlier Cold War, Cold War 1.0 if you like. Through its economic might, China's potential as a superpower is far greater than the Soviet Union's ever was. It is because of a recognition of this mutual interdependence that the American rhetoric first shifted from decoupling, which suggests a radical separation, to de-risking, which implies curbing risks while avoiding a clean break. Second, an important difference is the power asymmetry between the two in the economic realm, or rather beyond the economic realm. As superpowers emerging from the ashes of World War II, the US and the USSR were peer competitors in military terms from the very start, from 1945. The current situation is different, because China is well behind the US, but visibly and clearly, gradually catching up. According to the Pentagon, the Chinese Navy has surpassed the US Navy in terms of the number of battle force ships over the past decade, thanks to China's status as the world's top ship-producing nation by tonnage. Senior US Air Force officials have also noted the PLA's potential to become the world's biggest air force. It now has over 3,150 non-trainer and non-drone aircraft, compared with about 4,000 for the US. However, military commentators believe that until at least the PLA centennial in 2027, there will still be a military gap between the two countries. There are no proxy wars littering the landscape, as in the original Cold War, nor much of an appetite for any in either Beijing or Washington. Suppositing another Cold War-level bipolarity both overstates the current situation and the risk of any threat from China to the global order. Third, with the USSR, the contestation and the American assertion of power was as much about capitalism and liberal democracy being the dominant modes of social, economic, and political organization versus communism as the alternative system, as it was about winning the game of power. The US-China competition arguably is not about ideology. China is not known for any zeal to convert the world to communism. It's far more interested in finding itself a dominant place in the current world order than to overthrow the international system. Washington, under President Biden, experimented with the idea of a Summit for Democracy 2022, which seems to have conflated the goals of subduing its foremost political rival and espousing democracy as an ideal. But even Europeans haven't really bought into the democracy versus autocracy framework. The American instinct to couch all foreign policy in terms of democracy promotion is counterproductive. President Trump might abandon it anyway. China is not playing that game in any case and has no pretensions about their views of what they call Western-style democracy. Fourth, what also makes the China-America dynamic stand out is that the successor state to the erstwhile USSR, Russia, is never far from the action. We're all aware of the Ukraine crisis, of course, and how it's impacted the geostrategic rubric of Europe. But we mustn't forget that in just a few days, in fact, before Putin launched his incursion into Ukraine, he stood with Xi Jinping and announced a partnership with no limits, an ominous announcement for both the West and the rest. It's difficult to downplay the impact that Russia can have in this discussion. Based on its land area, massive natural resources, and a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, it outstrips most middle powers in the world today. In fact, many make the case that the US's bipolarity is not with the Chinese, but with an axis of both Russia and China. Professor Joseph Yoffe, for example, defines our world as a 2.5 power world, where Russia is held back from full parity with the US and China by its lack of usable power. With an economy smaller than Italy's and a military budget equaling only 1/4 of China's, Moscow is far from being a third pole, but it is clearly becoming China's junior partner. Now, no one recognizes this more than Beijing. Although it has not publicly condoned the act of war itself, China has continued to be a major supporter of Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. Economically, but also through the delivery of weapons components, even if Beijing has been careful so far in order to avoid Western sanctions. Prior to the Ukraine war, Russia was able to maintain a semblance of relative equidistance from China and the West, in part by maintaining close economic ties with the EU, which was dependent, of course, on Russia for its energy needs, Russian natural gas. The Kremlin also avoided sharing sensitive technologies with China and was an obstacle to Chinese expansion in Central Asia. But that's all changing now. Additionally, there are those who argue that Russia's traditional geopolitical relationships, like those with India and Vietnam, could temper its engagement with China. In the opinion of those commentators, the foundation of mutual respect, historical ties, and extensive cooperation in various sectors, including defense, space, and nuclear energy with countries like India and Vietnam, will make Moscow think twice before deepening cooperation with China, but I'm not so convinced by this view. Straining under the weight of Western sanctions, Russia now depends heavily on China, not least as an export market and a source of vital supplies. Chinese imports from Russia have increased by record margins since the war began, $240 billion in 2023, a 46.9% increase from the previous year. And China is the only country that can provide Russians with consumer goods that once came from Europe and the US. Moreover, according to Alexander Gabuev, a senior fellow of the Carnegie Endowment, the Chinese renminbi could well become the de facto reserve currency for Russia, even without being fully convertible. In backing Russia diplomatically, Xi demonstrates his refusal to be cowed by the West. And it doesn't hurt that Chinese companies, which have been reeling from regulatory crackdown since 2020, can now turn a tidy profit from their sales to Russia. The Kremlin, in any case, is in no position to complain about Chinese price gouging, let alone alienate China by failing to support its stance on key issues like Taiwan. As Gabuev put it, Russia is turning into a giant Eurasian Iran, fairly isolated, now with a smaller and more technologically backward economy, thanks to its hostility with the West. With few friends, Russia knows it has little choice but to stick with China. And a risen China has anyway seen less and less need to remain peaceful. Its tough new security clampdown in Hong Kong, you haven't forgotten your trade sanctions on Australia, the killing of Indian soldiers on our border, all of this reflect a newfound willingness to pursue its goals, its geopolitical goals, aggressively. So with this understanding of these 4 or 5 major factors I've outlined for you and how they shape the new bipolarity, we can look at how Washington has strategized its moves to safeguard its position in the balance of power. Naturally, the Americans realize that neither the Russians nor the Chinese can be addressed in isolation. In March 2024, for instance, Admiral John Aquilino, the former commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, described the relationship between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a nascent axis of evil. This assessment from Aquilino follows similar warnings from top US intelligence officials that Russia's war in Ukraine, while not yet successful in accomplishing all of Moscow's goals, has served to embolden China's leadership. CIA Director William Burns had added that Russian success in Ukraine could stoke the ambitions of the Chinese leadership in contingencies ranging from Taiwan to the South China Sea. The biggest creation as a consequence of this geopolitical churn is the entirely new canvas called the Indo-Pacific. It's fascinating for all hands of global diplomacy when new terms of art emerge and find widespread acceptance. And this has happened to Indo-Pacific, an expression that comes up often in conversations with foreigners, sometimes self-consciously, sometimes automatically, and sometimes with a slight tone of deference that's used by those who are striving to be politically correct. Whatever the case may be, the idea of the Indo-Pacific breaks down the separation of East Asia conceptually from South Asia and links the two geopolitically along with Australia. At the same time, the term reflects 3 interrelated developments. The first is China's declared intention of developing a blue water navy and becoming a transcontinental economic giant. The second is India's emergence as a regional power and a possible counterbalance to China, not to contain it. India is allergic to terms like containment, but perhaps to constrain its overweening power. And the third is the role which the US will play in shaping the contours of the seemingly irresistible shift in power from west to east and from the Atlantic to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Taken together, this ideation of the Indo-Pacific region captures the growing might, geopolitical interests, and normative visions of these powers in a dynamic region. Beijing's maritime advances have sprawled across the 2 oceans in a bid to secure its energy requirements and boost its trading ties. Besides its belligerence with India on the disputed frontier, its assertiveness with its maritime neighbors like Japan and Vietnam, and its growing strides in South Asian waters alongside the string of pearls of port facilities across the Indian Ocean, are all intended to shore up its geopolitical leverage. In terms of connectivity and infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative puts forward the Chinese-led plan to bind the geopolitical space. Economically, China is a crucial trading partner for all the major states in the region and also takes an active interest in leading economic partnerships in the region. As a response to this growing Chinese footprint in the region, where the US had been a net security provider, the Indo-Pacific has emerged as a continuum across the 2 oceans, joined together by its main trading channel, the Straits of Malacca. Now, this region is home to about 60% of the global population, 20 of the world's 33 megacities, and is also the source of more than half the world's global carbon emissions. This makes the region's countries key players in tackling global challenges such as the climate crisis. It's also become a major priority for Washington, as arms spending in this region has risen more quickly than anywhere else in the world over the last decade, and now makes up 30% of global military spending. The much touted Quad, consisting of the US, India, Australia, and Japan, is driven by the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which has more recently been augmented by the so-called Squad, of US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Added to this is the trilateral security partnership that you've got between, amongst you, the UK and the US, AUKUS, or however you've chosen to pronounce it, which involves, of course, these countries, the US in particular, assisting you in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. We can do it too, by the way, but you haven't asked us yet. The emergence of a theatre like the Indo-Pacific is emblematic of the specificity of this emerging bipolarity, the realignment of traditional alliances and geopolitical theatres. So before I wrap up my argument, there's another important facet of our current geopolitical state that I should refer to, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs has been a platform for the most insightful thinking on global governance to take root. So any exploration of the polarity or lack thereof of our current global order must address the relationship of that polarity to the structures of global governance. After all, the games of the balance of power mustn't overwhelm the imperative of cooperation for the broader global good. I see a former Australian ambassador to the UN sitting right here, and she knows exactly the sort of structures of global governance we used to try and celebrate and thought we were building up. As someone who spent nearly 3 decades in the UN singing the virtues of globalization, multilateralism, and the ability of our institutions of global governance to bring us all together, I'm not so sure of its prospects today. As I pointed out in yesterday's discussion on multilateralism, every country has had to fend for itself in a very volatile environment, and global governance has been largely absent from the scene. It's also inescapable today that current global crises, or recent global crises like the coronavirus pandemic, environmental disasters taking place every year, oblige the US and China to confront the same problems, face the same threats, and hopefully seize the same opportunities. What we used to call in my UN days problems without passports require blueprints without borders to resolve. Global cooperation would serve the world far better than intensified rivalry. Yesterday I spoke mainly of the crises facing multilateralism. But paradoxically, the eroding credibility of conventional multilateral engagement is accompanied by the emergence of issues too broad to be amenable to a unilateral brush: terrorism, migration, climate change, cybersecurity, the rise of artificial intelligence. So the new reality is that the world I have discussed today is simply less able to cope with war and the resultant sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and restrictions of currency flows. For a few heady years, we actually enjoyed the fruits of interdependence, as trade and currency flowed freely and prosperity transcended borders. Today we are realizing that even a local war in the 21st century can have a global impact, including in creating new geopolitical fault lines which have forced countries to make difficult strategic choices. The UN has every reason to worry about its continuing relevance, with its image in the eyes of the public in further decline on account of its perceived inertia in preventing the Ukraine war, the invasion of the sovereign borders of one of its own member states by a permanent member of the Security Council, and also by its failure to even mitigate the horrendous loss of life in Israel's ongoing campaign in Gaza. Whereas the UN was the forum of choice in navigating global cooperation during the Cold War and preventing the world collapsing into another global conflict, today it no longer seems like the default option to counter the emerging global bipolarity. Now let me really wrap up. Like Egyptian mummies, we're all pressed for time. So given the nuances of the bipolarity I've gone to for you today, it is important to understand what drives state actors and to get our own priorities right. There's little doubt that Washington and Beijing, as of now, stand far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of their comprehensive national power. It's also equally clear that the movement toward a new geoeconomic equilibrium, as embodied in the economic trends marking deglobalization, as some call it, or reglobalization, depending on how you see it, is going to play a key role in determining the balance of power between them. Compared to the Cold War, today's bipolarity is definitely weaker, both because the power differential between the Americans and the Chinese is being diffused by the rise of the middle powers, and because they're hobbled by their respective domestic turbulences. At this critical juncture, where two rival powers are competing to eclipse each other in every sphere of importance, yet are not, thankfully, fighting each other belligerently, the world as a whole must proceed with caution. I'm confident that as it grows from strength to strength, as it has since its inception, the Australian Institute of International Affairs will help us chart a roadmap which these problem solvers and change makers can eventually follow, leading all of us away from the disorder and discord of today to a happier and hopefully more harmonious world tomorrow. Thank you all very much. Happy to take it.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go to questions, and I see we have one already.
Zara Gibson, National Vice President.
Good morning,
Could
Zara.
you tell us a little bit about India's relations with its close neighbours, Pakistan and Bangladesh, because they're not that easy. And maybe just very quickly, India's always been quite supportive of Israel. What is the situation there?
Right, well, I think the one word for the relationship with Pakistan and Bangladesh is fraught. Pakistan, I'm afraid, it's an existential problem in that when Pakistan was created, there were certain, shall we say, fundamental issues with it. To paraphrase Voltaire on Russia, in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And the army has found it absolutely essential to maintain sufficient trouble on both of its borders, east and west, to ensure that the army receives the highest share of any country's resources on the planet. There is no army of any country in the world that has a larger percentage of either its GDP or of its defense budget. Not even Myanmar. So that is the extraordinary story of Pakistan for the last 70 odd years. And in that period, hostility with India was a sine qua non. I think it was manageable. There were a couple of formal wars, and then the Pakistanis stumbled across the tactic, honed, I'm afraid, during the Mujahideen campaign against the Soviets in Afghanistan, of instead using proxies, terrorists and militants being spirited across the border to wreak havoc on ordinary people and indeed on Indian military and police forces. In order to, as one Pakistani strategist memorably wrote, to bleed India with 1,000 cuts rather than take it on in a direct war. So that is what India has been dealing with since 1989. There have been periodic eruptions into something worse. The famous Kargil conflict of 1999 in Pakistan sent soldiers dressed in civvies across the border to take some strategic heights, and then the Indians fought them back and expelled them from there. But the whole thing was then followed by a serious peace initiative, which again crumbled when Pakistani terrorists, being commanded on the phone every minute by handlers in Pakistan, killed 166 Indians in the famous 26/11 attack in Mumbai in 2008, after which relations have simply not been anything close to normal, as you can well understand. Currently, we have no ambassadors or high commissioners in each other's country. There's this very, very sort of bristling hostility between the two, which is augmented by periodic eruptions of terrorist violence. India prefers to look beyond China, beyond Pakistan to China, but China is itself a major enabler of Pakistan. The largest single Belt and Road Initiative project that China has is in Pakistan. A highway connecting western China and Xinjiang all the way down to the Baluch coast and port of Gwadar. So it's really a major headache for India, which India thinks it can afford to ignore, but I'm not sure that that's ever going to be possible. It's also true that every time India wanted to make peace, there was not a receptivity on the other side. There have also been spasms of time when it looked as if the Pakistanis wanted to make peace, but the Indians have been burned too often to be receptive either. So there's been this sort of disconnect between the two. And so I can't say anything particularly inspired. There's a lot more detail I could give you, but I'll spare you for now. Bangladesh was a different kind of problem in that India was extremely close to the government of Sheikh Hasina Wajid, so close that they were seen as almost embedded with each other. And then she was overthrown by a popular revolt in February this year and has since come and sought refuge in India. But as a result, as you can imagine, relations with the interim government that has succeeded her are again somewhat complicated. There is no open hostility, but there's certainly mutual suspicion, and a lot remains to be seen what arrangements will follow the interim arrangements, how long the interim will last, and so on. But matters have been inflamed by a number of attacks on minorities in Bangladesh, in particular what used to be a very sizable Hindu minority, which has dwindled in recent years to about 7% of the population, and they have experienced a lot of attacks, vandalism of their temples, places of worship, cultural centers, and so on. And symbols of Indo-Bangladesh cooperation. India, as you may remember, defeated Pakistan in the War of 71, thus creating Bangladesh. But symbols of all of those things have been systematically destroyed by attacks by vandals. So it's not, again, a good climate in that particular relationship. As for Israel, India was traditionally very pro-Palestinian right from the beginning. In fact, though it recognized Israel fairly quickly after Israel's creation, it waited till 1992 to upgrade relations to the ambassadorial level. But thereafter, the two countries had become very close and friendly, particularly with the rise of Islamist extremism, in which, of course, the two could make common cause, share intelligence and national security information, and so on. So they've become much closer. The ascent of a Hindu chauvinist government under Narendra Modi in India has also compounded this, because Islamophobia and Muslim bashing is sort of part of the DNA of the ruling party. I'm sorry, I'm from the opposition, so I can say these things. But I say these things all the time in India anyway, so I'm just repeating it. But as a result, therefore, they do have no. The government doesn't seem to be too concerned about Israel continuing its disastrously long campaign that has taken a toll of 43,000 Palestinian lives and 92,000 injured, which seems out of all proportion to the initial provocation. But be that as it may, India has, therefore, I think, as you rightly said, now been seen very much as a sympathizer of Israel's, and indeed it abstained on no fewer than 20 General Assembly resolutions condemning what Israel's doing in Gaza and calling for a ceasefire, which seems slightly odd for the land of Mahatma Gandhi, but I'll leave it there. Those sort of capsule summaries. Yeah.
Hello, yeah. My name is Marcus Krams, Ambassador of Latvia. And,
Sorry, could you hold the mic a little closer? I didn't hear that.
Right, yeah. Marcus Krams, Ambassador of Latvia, and
how are you, sir?
Very, very thrilled about your expose. And the question is about development of architecture, international.
I'm sorry, the question is about?
About architecture in general, and just to build on what you said about that the UN was the kind of choice, or basically the choice, yeah. And here the question is about the BRICS. I don't think you ever touched that word. And
Brexit?
BRICS.
BRICS, you're right. I didn't mention.
Yes, and certainly this is kind of probably not very new, but still a platform which is emerging, and I think that those, particularly the core members of the BRICS, they sort of say put quite substantial input into that, and so whether that's something what you would consider as something like a format which is going to be intended to substitute something else in the world, and how it looks in the light of bipolarity, that's one thing, and secondly also in this triangle which you described elegantly about India, Russia, China. Basically, yeah, what are your thoughts about the elections of India and the future of BRICS?
Sure. No, that's a good question. The reason I didn't go into all of that was precisely because of the limitations of time, so I took one topic and focused on that. But you're quite right. That BRICS is emerging. In fact, I've observed elsewhere that increasingly multilateralism, the universality of the UN, seems to be supplanted in many ways by what you might call minilateralism or plurilateralism of smaller alphabet soups of groupings. India certainly participates in many of them, and one could argue that in many ways what has happened is that the world seemed to have been, before this bipolarity became clear, seemed to have been moving away from the US-led unipolar moment to what I might call a sort of internet kind of moment, that is a networked world where countries were connected to each other, rather like on the internet, for different purposes at different times, rather than locked into specific groupings. And India is a very good example of that. You mentioned the Russia, India, China trilateral meeting every year called RIC. Then, of course, they added the Brazilians, it became BRIC. Then the South African joined, became BRICS. Then you've got, in a sense, the same group minus the Russians and the Chinese gives you IBSA, IBSA, for South-South cooperation amongst those three southern giants. And then you add the Chinese but kick out the Russians and have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And of course, India is a member of all of these, and not only because its name very conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, but because it believes it has something to contribute to each of them and has something to gain from each of them. And that's what I think is so particularly striking about this collection of groupings. Now, BRICS itself, it started off, as I said, with a group of 4, then it became 5. Last year it grew to 11, and now there are some 26 knocking on the doors and who were invited as observers to the last BRICS summit. Now, I don't quite know, I think there's some hesitation on the part of some members. Certainly New Delhi doesn't seem terribly enthusiastic about it keeping on growing, because if it keeps on growing to become another reflection of the global south, then you're going to end up with sort of 2 organizations or 2 groupings. When Penny and I were at the UN, we had a thing called the G77, which was kind of the global trade union of developing countries of the UN, which grew to, in fact, 133 members, even though it continued calling itself the G77. Now, I think that would not be a fate that would be welcome for BRICS. I think you really want to keep it small enough so they can cooperate, talk to each other, dialogue, implement things, and so on. But now the geopolitics of it are getting complicated, because if China and Russia are forming an axis, which is part of what my speech was about, where does that leave the countries that don't necessarily see themselves affiliated to such an axis? Where does a country like Brazil or a country like India fit in when they have their own relations with the United States, for example, and with the West? So I think some of these questions are being asked and not yet answered. And that's why I think that as far as BRICS is concerned, we will have to wait and watch. But I do see this emerging US-China bipolarity, which will be accentuated, I believe, by President Trump's ascent to office, as the really major feature of the world, to which these different plurilateral groupings may have to accommodate, adjust, either shrink or withdraw. India, for example, belongs to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's 9 countries. Again, lots of countries knocking on the door to get in. But that was seen very much as a Russia-China-led outfit. If BRICS becomes another Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's no good either for countries like India and Brazil. So there are a lot of questions we sorted out. That last expansion brought in countries like the Saudis, for example, and Egypt, who are far from sold on that side of the bipolar equation. So it may well be a conscious effort to try and prevent BRICS expansion becoming a tool of one side in the global bipolarity. Let's wait and see.
Okay, we are brushing up against time, but if you'll indulge us, we'll
Sure.
have one more. Prakash, you've had your hand up since the beginning, so...
Thanks, Dr. Tharoor. Prakash Merchandani, Australian Institute of International Affairs, Victoria. Slightly different question, and good to see you again. About India. How is India tight-roping this Russia-US relationship in relation to the war? It seems like quite a difficult task. I understand you're in the opposition.
No, but so far it's been doing it quite successfully.
Well, worse than this. India's in a tough spot. How is it actually managing to balance this?
Right. Well, I actually made what turned out with hindsight, made a completely wrong-headed speech in Parliament, warning India against the line it was taking on Russia, and saying that this, not only are we going to be on the wrong side of history, but it will complicate other national interests. And as it's turned out so far, it hasn't. We have we've taken advantage of both sides of this conflict so far. We were the first country to fly humanitarian aid into Ukraine before the end of February, within days of the war. But we were also doing oil and gas deals with Russia, as a result of which Indian imports of Russian oil and gas, which were at 2% of our total imports of energy needs, have now gone up to 40%. The Russians don't have too many other buyers. The West and the US in particular have sort of condoned this or turned a blind eye to it, largely because they fully realize that if India didn't do that and Russian oil had no buyers, it would drive the price up of everybody else's oil, thereby costing American voters at the pump, for example, and so on and so forth. So there's this peculiar arrangement going on. India also refines a lot of the Russian fuel it's importing and then sells it as Indian refined fuel to America and the UK. So, there's a certain amount, if you like, of cynicism around, all around on this one. So in other words, it's been able to get away with retaining its closeness to Russia. When Modi went to Moscow and gave Putin his trademark hug, Zelensky understandably issued a very bitter statement. Whereupon, within 2 weeks, Modi had gone to Ukraine and given Zelensky the same hug. So India is still trying to play both sides, not just walking that tightrope, but dancing on it. And a somewhat modified Zelensky even started talking about India being a potential peacemaker between the countries. China still remains a problem. There has been a recent breakthrough, as I said, on the border, though we still have to see exactly how that's going to be implemented. The Chinese have not been particularly, shall we say, not been particularly reassuring in their conduct in the last few years. We've had a modus vivendi on the border. Since 1976, not a single shot had been fired in anger and no one had lost their lives. There was a standoff in 2017 in the Bhutanese territory of Doklam, which had no earthly use to anybody. It's a pure snow-covered plateau. No grass grows there. No farmers come and graze sheep or whatever, but it overlooks a vital highway for India that connects most of the Indian mainland to our northeastern states, so a narrow strip of territory between Bangladesh and Bhutan called the Chicken's Neck. Well, the only reason to be in Doklam is to be able, in the event of hostilities, to interdict that highway. Why the Chinese decided this was an important strategic objective for them obviously raises very troubling questions in Indian minds. So the Indians intercepted them. There was a 72-day standoff, diplomatic negotiation. The Chinese withdrew. And then they promptly went to another part of the Doklam Plateau and have now got artillery dominating those heights and prepared to fire on India anytime they get the order. So that's not exactly a welcome development. At the same time, India's import dependence in China has been shooting up. It's currently, our trade deficit is $101 billion in 2023 with China. The Chinese don't buy any of our stuff and they throw up trade and tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers to those who get to China. But they sell us things hand over fist, and the Indian business community has become so hopelessly dependent on these imports. They won't let Mr. Modi crack down on that. Indeed, the economic advisor to the government actually wrote a report this year urging more Chinese investment in the Indian economy. So there are these ambiguities, and it remains to be seen whether the so-called truce that's come out in recent weeks will actually be accompanied by a serious Chinese withdrawal or a return to the status quo ante April, May 2020, when all the trouble started, or whether this is going to be another fate, as Doklam turned out to be, and they will hold on to their strategic positions. The Chinese, I think, have played a game for some years now of maintaining the dispute and refusing to discuss its settlement, so the border remains undefined, but using that undefined border periodically to throw India off guard while they're off balance, while at the same time, creating flashpoints every once in a while in order to demonstrate that they have the capacity to needle India and more. So it's been a very precarious. That one, India, as I said, been walking the tightrope with importing from China, but being wary on the border. So far, I think I have to say, India has been able to manage all these contradictions, but the contradictions are there, and it would be unwise not to be aware of them. We'll just have to see, again, as I said to the ambassador from that, we'll have to see how these things evolve, but it's certainly very tensely and precariously poised.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay. Sure.
All right, thank you so much, Shashi Tharoor. I have been wanting to invite Dr. Tharoor to the Institute for some time now, actually, and I think you can see why, sir. Your erudition and eloquence are something to behold. I'd also like to note that Shashi writes as beautifully as he speaks, and summer is coming up, so I'd encourage you to get one of his books for the summer holiday. But for now, that ends the proceedings of the AIIA National Conference 2024. Very, very pleased for the many shout-outs to the institution as well, Dr. Tharoor. I think very, very, very complimentary but also accurate statements. And I would like to thank you all for taking part in this, our cornerstone event of the Institute this year. We do hope that we will see you all again next year. And for now, I would bid you a good morning. Thank you very much.